The Rasmussen case was probably the oldest unsolved case that I have ever had to go back and look at.
What in God's name, why did they murder her?
The case then goes cold until there's a massive revolution in forensic science called DNA.
When the DNA profile finally did come back, it turned the case on its head.
Once you realize who the suspect is, you kind of wish it was anybody else. I think every homicide detective feels like they owe something to the victim. We see them in their worst moment. You're going to be the last one to actually speak for them. You're going to be the one that's going to say, this is what happened to this person. They can't tell you what it is, but I can. My name is Robert Bubb. I'm retired from the Los Angeles Police Department, where I did 33 years, 22 of which I worked homicide. This is the story of one of the most interesting cases I've been involved in, and it happened 23 years before I'd ever heard of the victim. The case itself is intrinsically linked with one of the greatest scientific advances for police work, DNA. Sherry Rasmussen. She'd been married for approximately 4 months. It had been what some would call a whirlwind romance. She'd only met him about a year or so before. John Rutten, her husband. They'd moved into the condo that they shared in the city of Van Nuys. They were a striking couple, your department store picture frame couple. John was an engineer. Sherry was the director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Hospital. She'd been brought in fairly young to that position, but it was a testament to her qualities, her intelligence, and her personality. She was very well liked by her coworkers and her friends, loved by her family, her husband. The original detective on the Sherry Rasmussen case, Lyle Meyer, he'd been with Van Nuys for a number of years and had an extensive career working homicide.
When I arrived, obviously there was patrol officers there that had secured the crime scene. The condo is lovely. It was the type of place that a young married couple would be in. They're starting their young careers, they're starting their lives. We obviously did investigative procedures at the crime scene. There was photographs taken from all positions. There was fingerprints taken by fingerprint experts. We interviewed John. John apparently came home from work, entered the residence through the subterranean garage, and when he came upstairs, John immediately saw that his wife was lying in the middle of the living room floor and obviously deceased. He was extremely distraught naturally. He gave me information that could be corroborated. We did that immediately so that eliminate him as an initial suspect. It was very obvious there was a tremendous struggle in the complex. There was no obvious areas of entry that had been broken into. Seeing the ransacking and the stacking of electronic equipment near the exit door to the garage led us to believe that a residential burglary was what was going on here. The decedent was still dressed in night clothing. It appeared to myself and my investigative partner that The decedent had been scared by an intruder. The suspect pulled a gun on her, possibly threatening her. In my opinion, Sherry was fighting for her life. Arms were waving. The gun was being fired. The shots were going up into a glass window frame. The suspect, I believe, was losing the fight. I believe the decedent got the gun away from the suspect. But was afraid to shoot the suspect. There was probably talk, there was probably screaming. It was obvious in the investigative process the suspect was panicking, losing the fight, bit the decedent on the arm tremendously, a full teeth bite mark on the arm. Obviously, the decedent was in pain, in my opinion. Dropped the gun. The suspect grabbed a porcelain statue and hit the decedent over the head. I think knocked her out. The suspect then utilized a pillow, put it over the decedent, and shot and executed the person. And from there, we began the day-to-day trudging of an investigation into a homicide. I did an analysis of the recovered bullets. I did a great investigative trajectory path of the gunshots.
In the initial investigation, one of the things that we were able to determine was the weapon used by type and caliber was a .38 or .357 caliber handgun based on the striations, the twists, and the bullets themselves that were recovered, and that it was a revolver because there was no brass, no expended shell casings left behind as you would find with a semi-automatic handgun.
There was a reward provided by the City of Los Angeles for any information leading to the arrest and conviction of the murder of Sherry Rasmussen. We canvassed the whole San Fernando Valley burglary reports. And then a breakthrough. There had been a number of residential burglaries within the area, and the fact that there was a residential burglary a couple of weeks prior in a complex similar to this, not far away, where two suspects were observed. One of them did have a gun. We thought, wow, this is a great piece of investigative information for us. We developed some composite drawings of them, but they were kind of generic.
As a detective, having something so similar occur in proximity to where your murder occurred, I can see that as being a viable lead, something that you'd want to follow up on.
At that particular time, we had minimal evidence to indicate anything other than a residential burglary gone bad, where the suspect had a gun, the victim confronted the persons, and shots were fired. The victim lost. Unfortunately, after that, our investigation never led us to any significant suspect or suspects. It was kind of a dead end. Eventually, you have to move on and do other cases because there's other families that are going through exactly the same situation. After 60 days, I had to write an extensive report which was submitted to the Robbery Homicide Unit and the Chief of Police. After that, the case becomes a cold case. At one point, we cleared all of our homicides in Van Nuys during the 80s. But the fact that hers was unsolved was a challenge to all of us. You were always looking for someone who might give you some information about the murder of Sherry. This was the case that I wanted to solve, and we just could not get that investigative lead to solve the case. Time was not on our side.
Nothing weighs more on a detective than knowing that they couldn't solve a case. They hope maybe down the road somebody else picks up and is able to push it over the finish line. When the original detectives walked into the Rasmussen apartment that night, the idea of DNA wasn't anything that was even close to a viable investigative tool. They had what they had, and they exhausted what they had to the best of their abilities. But the advent of DNA was really a step forward, especially in the area of homicide investigation.
Well, the first DNA case in the United States was in Florida. That individual was prosecuted in 1987. And from there, it just grew and grew.
DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It is the molecular blueprint for all of life. DNA is this amazing long molecule that's twisted and wound up inside of every cell of our body. And in essence, it makes us unique. It makes us who we are and unique from each other.
In the early 2000s, the Los Angeles Police Department, out of Robbery Homicide Division, created a cold case homicide unit that basically went back and looked at a number of cases that, because of the advent of DNA, might then be worked. And the Sherry Rasmussen case was one of the cases.
In November 2001, I was a detective with the Los Angeles Police Department Robbery Homicide Division, Cold Case Squad. With Sherry Rasmussen, when I obtained the reports, and I was able to look at the photographs from the crime scene, looks like she fought for her life. It appears that she's at home alone. Her husband went to work that morning, and somebody broke in, or she opened the door for someone, and there just was one hell of a fight. There's blood streaks on the wall, windows are broken out, things are toppled. I think the stereo speakers and stereo equipment was stacked up as if a burglar might have been intending to take them. This is a woman totally innocent, and then somebody murders her brutally. I mean, just stood over her and shot into her body. So that one I wanted to solve. I went back through the autopsy.
The decedent had numerous points of trauma. She had 3 gunshot wounds to the torso, to the front of her. She also had blunt force trauma of the head and face. She had bruising, abrasions, and lacerations. That means that there was close contact between the assailant and her when she's being killed. A bite mark was noted on the decedent's left arm. We don't see bite marks that often in forensic medicine, but when we see a bite mark, it has been drilled into us that we have to swab that bite mark, particularly for an assailant's saliva. So you don't want to push too deep, but you don't want to be too light because you need to try to get as much off of that bite mark as you possibly can.
The bite mark was photographed, measured, and they swabbed the bite mark to do blood typing, which was the science of the day.
You might be surprised to know that you could actually determine a person's blood type by looking at other body fluids, because 80% of us are called secretors. So in other words, we secrete similar proteins that allow us to determine what your blood type is in your saliva.
There were 2 different blood types found there.
O, which was Sherry's.
The other blood type that was found there was an A.
A suspect who is a secretor, and you can determine that his blood type is A, narrows your suspect pool down to about 40% of the general population.
So in the 1980s, even though we weren't doing DNA typing, there were good habits in place because you understood that you could take these stains. But as long as you preserved them, you dried them, you put them in a freezer, you kept them in the dark. All these steps try to preserve the stains for improved testing.
You knew that person had physically touched our victim, had bitten our victim. So great, we have some DNA. And then we made requests and submitted the sample to our lab for the testing.
The job of a forensic scientist is to provide support to investigators that are trying to solve these very difficult crimes. I don't know if you can imagine what it's like to walk into a room and see a dead body and be the person responsible for figuring out who did that. And that's why the evolution of DNA has been so amazing. The first DNA test started looking at perhaps one marker, or the next test, maybe 9 markers. Well, the last test, the test we now use, allow us to look at something called amylogenin, and that's a marker that tells us whether it's from a male or a female. If it's from a male, we'll see an X and a Y chromosome is present. If it's from a female, we'll see an X and an X.
The criminalist informed me, gave me a call and said, hey, I typed it for DNA. I said, okay, and? She goes, it's a female. And that kind of set me back. I said, a female.
We started out just maybe being able to answer the question, does this person's DNA match? Now we can actually get potential lead information from some of it. We can say whether it's from a male, whether it's from a female. They might have assumed this bite mark was made from a male, but in fact, it's made from a female. So that had to have changed the whole direction of the investigation.
The Rasmussen case was probably the oldest unsolved case that I have ever had to go back and look at. Most of the cases, just by nature of how old they were and other circumstances, a lot of the evidence was no longer around. It hadn't been stored properly, or for one reason or another, mistakes are made and some of the evidence is disposed of. The surprising thing in the Rasmussen case was when the DNA profile came back and the secondary profile, aside from Sherry Rasmussen, came back to a female. Not what the original detectives had looked at. Historically, there were very few female burglars. Maybe we need to start looking at someone closer to Sherry.
Suddenly now you're looking at suspects who might have known your victim, who are female and might have had a reason to not like the victim. So, especially in this particular case, I think that was a real breakthrough, that they could use this DNA typing to give them a lead like that.
At that point, we started to turn around and re-examine the case again with fresh eyes, and little things started to jump out at us that seemed to fly in the face of the initial burglary theory. You can look at a cold case and you can look at photographs, you can look at diagrams. The drawer that was pulled out from the end table in between the 2 chairs might initially look like something had been ransacked. But again, then you look at the coffee table itself, and something that would hit the coffee table strong enough to knock those items off, but not knock the coffee table offline with the couch and the love seat, just didn't jibe for us. The placement itself of the audiovisual equipment at the bottom of stairs, when the initial point of entry for a burglar was determined to be the front door because there were no forced entry anywhere else, you would think that those items would be placed closer to the front door. A different picture started to emerge for us. The fact that it's a contact wounds and there's a bite mark, it's a close, more personal murder than, say, a burglar who's being caught and just wants to escape, fires a couple of rounds and takes off. It just didn't jibe. Once we knew that it was a female, this led us to believe that possibly the entire burglary scene had been staged. We began to compile a list of people, females in Sherry's life, who may have had contact with her, who may have had a dispute with her. We narrowed it down to 5 women that we wanted to take a look at and eliminate. Her mother and her sister, she had a roommate, There was a female that she'd had an issue with at Glendale Adventist Hospital, and then there was possibly an ex-girlfriend of Sherry's husband, John. In looking at her mother and her sister, they were eliminated just because familial DNA would have been a much closer match than what we actually found. We went back to Nels Rasmussen, Sherry's father. He informed us that we should be looking at the ex-girlfriend of Sherry's husband, John, that he thought may have been capable of committing this crime. After the murder occurred, John moved in with some friends, I believe, in the San Diego area, and eventually relocated there. He met his current wife, and they married and began raising a family, and he's been in San Diego area ever since. Our initial inquiry into Sherry's husband, John, was just to inform him that we were investigating the case again. He was cooperative. We asked John who this ex-girlfriend was. John identified Stephanie Lazarus to us. They'd met while both attending college at UCLA, and that they'd had kind of an off and on again relationship. All indications were that she was more attracted to John than John was to her. When he and Sherry met and started dating, he told Stephanie that their relationship was over. Once we had identified through John Rutten that Stephanie Lazarus was his ex-girlfriend, we went back to Nels Rasmussen, Sherry's father. He informed us that in late January of 1986, Sherry had been at a family event, and that Sherry had related a story to him that a female had shown up at Glendale Adventist Hospital. And during that verbal confrontation had said, if I can't have John, nobody's going to have him. It left Sherry with a sense of foreboding. When we started looking at Stephanie Lazarus' lead in hopes that this would connect up with Sherry's murder, we started going back through the book to see if there were mention of her name. It was a shock to our system. We were looking at an active duty police officer for murder. There's a gamut of emotions that you run through. You realize who the suspect is and what this means for the department, for her family. This was going to be difficult.
I think that there's the initial moment of kind of disbelief. You know, one of our own officers was suspected in committing a brutal murder.
Stephanie Lazarus was a highly decorated and a very well-liked police detective on the Los Angeles Police Department. She'd been in some sought-after jobs. She was a DARE instructor, which is officers that would teach about drug abuse. She had made detective. She'd worked internal affairs for a certain amount of time, and she was eventually selected to go to the Commercial Crimes Division, and she was one of two detectives who specialized in forged and stolen art.
I knew very little about Stephanie Lazarus. I certainly had seen her around the building many times. I knew that she was an instructor for the department on certain subjects. I knew that she had a reputation for being very outgoing, aggressive, high-energy person. It was abundantly clear that maintaining the confidentiality, the actual secrecy of this case was going to be paramount. Notwithstanding the fact that Stephanie Lazarus at that time worked on our floor in the next office and was often in our offices, you know, socializing with her friends and colleagues that she knew in our division.
If Lazarus didn't pan out as a viable suspect, we didn't want a good officer's reputation and her name dragged through the mud if it turned out she had absolutely nothing to do with the case. So all our conversations with regards to that were made with the door closed. It was a peculiar feeling that we were investigating one of our own for a murder, but the other side of that coin, the family and the victim, they deserved a certain amount of justice, and it wasn't anything that we were going to pack up and put away. We did the same background that we would do on any suspect, short of being able to interview coworkers, family members, because it would tip them off as to that we were looking at her with regards to a murder. As we looked at Stephanie Lazarus's background, we found that she had been married to another detective on the department, and that detective was assigned to a division which was on the floor just below us at Van Nuys Division. We ran her through the computer system to find out what weapons had been registered to her. She'd had two 2-inch revolvers, .38 caliber, that were registered to her. That was the caliber of the bullet that had killed Sherry Rasmussen. It struck me as odd that someone would own 2 of them. We found out that the first 2-inch .38 she reported stolen from the city of Santa Monica, and the second one was purchased, I believe, about 10 days after the murder occurred. In addition, she'd been on a few days off leading up to and including the day the murder occurred. We knew we could go no further with it without a more positive link between Stephanie Lazarus and the murder itself. We elected to attempt to get a DNA sample. There was no other real viable leads beyond Stephanie Lazarus at that point, and the DNA was a make or break item. We need to get a DNA sample from Stephanie Lazarus. While some people may think the DNA for an active officer is on file, there is no file for active officers. Your DNA is not sampled and is not stored anywhere for later comparison. Even fingerprints that are taken when you come on the job are kept in a separate file in the Department of Justice in Sacramento in California.
There are 3 ways you could get a DNA reference sample. The first way is you could ask them. When you interview them or you talk to them, you can ask them to voluntarily give you a sample. The second way is you go to a judge, you establish probable cause, and they give you a court order or a search warrant of some kind, and that then forces the individual to give you a sample.
The third way that you can go about trying to get a DNA sample would actually be to surreptitiously collect a sample. Investigators can follow the individual around and wait for them to discard something in the trash, on the ground.
It is legal for us to collect anything that's been abandoned, if you think of it that way.
When we're looking at a suspect, even in a cold case, they are a murder suspect, and there's a certain amount of deference you have to pay to that for the safety of the people around them, for officer safety. Well, at this point, our next step was going to have to be something along the lines of the surreptitious DNA. We elected to go through our Professional Standards Bureau, which works just these kinds of cases where a suspect is a police officer. The PSB surveillance unit followed Stephanie Lazarus on a day that she was off. She had gone to a store and had gotten a soda. When she was done, she put the cup and straw in a trash receptacle. Once she left the scene, they recovered it and brought it down to be booked. And then it was submitted for testing.
Potentially on the end of the straw would be coming in contact with an individual's mouth, which would then leave saliva and genetic material behind in the form of buccal cells or the skin cells that line the inside lining of your mouth. In the lab, you could swab the straw and go ahead and start the DNA analysis procedure with that straw by analyzing the swab.
By the nature of this case, it was rushed. I received a phone call from our SID people. We were informed that it was indeed a match between the DNA swab from the bite mark and the swab from the soda that was discarded by Stephanie Lazarus. The original murder happened in 1986. I mean, this was 23 years prior, and the idea that the evidence was still there, that it was still viable enough, and then the years after that, that you're able to actually get a DNA match. We knew that if the DNA did come back to Stephanie Lazarus, that the case would be transferred downtown. At that point, I received a phone call from one of the supervisors at Robbery Homicide Division. He said, I understand you have a case for me. Robbery Homicide Division are the best of the best. These are detectives that come from all divisions across the city. They've all had extensive homicide experience. They've worked big cases. They've worked notable cases. Detective Dan Jaramillo and Detective Greg Stearns were the main case agents.
Well, certainly there was a big concern that if Stephanie became aware of this investigation, that she could flee, that she might harm herself, that she might harm other people. This is obviously something that she had gotten away with for 26 years. She was getting close to retirement. I mean, her career with the department was about to end on a happy note. And she was married, had a young daughter, and obviously there was no good outcome. My partner and I, we really had to start concentrating on trying to devise a strategy for interviewing Stephanie Lazarus and trying to see if we could find a way to get her to sit down with us and talk about a murder that we believe she had committed. We'd been given a directive from the chief of police that we had to interview her in our jail. And his reasoning was that he wanted us in an environment where weapons are not allowed. As a matter of policy in our jail, you're not allowed to be armed. We had an entire operational plan that had been set up, and we had a search warrant to search Stephanie's home, her vehicles, and also her workspace and her car at work. There was a surveillance element that followed Stephanie, making sure that she actually came to work, because again, we were very concerned about her being tipped off. And if she was to try and flee, then we had a surveillance entity that was there to prevent that from happening. There were team leaders that were designated. They were given sealed envelopes, and they were told to go to various locations. And the team leader would open the envelope, and then they would understand, what was happening. I mean, I think that the majority of the division felt that we were arresting a politician from the city because the level of secrecy was so high. So there were a lot of moving pieces that day, apart from just the interview itself. So we get the word that Stephanie arrived at work. My partner went to go make contact with her. I went down to the jail. I turned on the equipment so that she could be recorded. How are we going to get Stephanie to come to the jail to come talk to us? The plan was that my partner, Dan Jaramillo, approached her at her desk that morning and told her that we had this suspect in custody who was talking about stolen art, and would she mind coming down to the jail where he was to talk to him and help us out. This is probably the most pressure I'd ever felt in interviewing a suspect.
Do you know John Rutten?
John Rutten? John Rutten?
Rutten.
Oh yeah, I went to school with him. I mean, what, are you guys, is this something, I mean, you said I was going to interview somebody about art, and now you guys are, I mean.
Had you ever met his wife?
I may have.
Remember the first name?
Shelley, Sherry, I don't know, something maybe, like I said, it's been so many years.
And once we have to transition and pivot to the subject of the murder, I think we both expected that that interview was going to end, but this was probably going to be a 5-minute interview. It's always important to try and get a statement from a suspect to try and understand from their perspective why this murder happened. Obviously, the end goal would be a confession.
From all the years, as far as you can remember, do you remember ever talking to her? Just
And there had been an incident in which Stephanie had come to Sherry's workplace at the hospital, and there had been a verbal confrontation, and it had been witnessed by Sherry's secretary. Well, Sherry's secretary had passed away in the intervening years, and so that was something that was never going to be able to come into a court of law because we didn't have a witness. However, in speaking to Stephanie, she obviously remembered that that altercation had taken place and that it had been witnessed by at least one person.
Yeah, I may have, I'm thinking back now. You guys are bringing up all these whole memories, and now I'm thinking I may have gone to her and say, hey, you know what? Is he dating you? He's bothering me, and so I'm thinking that we had a conversation about that.
So that was a huge get for us in the interview because we could now corroborate a pretty significant event that had happened.
Do you know what happened to his wife?
Yeah, I know she got killed.
As we started to get closer and closer to the subject of the death of Sherry, the murder, that, visibly that she was becoming more and more nervous.
Did you ever fight with her?
You mean like we fought?
Yeah. Did you ever duke it out with her?
No, I don't think so. I mean...
You'd remember that, right? That would be pretty...
Yeah, I would think so.
Pretty specific.
Yeah, like I said, I mean,
dramatic.
obviously... it just doesn't sound familiar. I mean, what are they saying? So I fought with her, so now, I'm getting the jump, the leap. They're saying, okay, I fought with her, so I must have killed her. I mean, come on. I mean, that's, I don't even... people are. I can't even say I met any of these people. I mean, it's insane.
And it's relating to, a guy that you were dating, but she's dating now, and it's just kind of like a whole love triangle type of thing. I mean, you figure you'd remember that, right?
Well, I would think.
Yes. So if we ask you to the point to give us a DNA sample, a buccal swab, so we can identify or eliminate you, would you be willing to do that?
Maybe. Because I know this,
Well, that's where we're at, too. I mean, because right now, from looking at the evidence, it's possible we may have some DNA at the location.
I just can't even believe it. I mean, it's just, I'm shocked. I'm really shocked that somebody would be saying that I did this. I mean, we had a fight, and so I went and killed her. I mean, come on.
Well,
that's...
Okay. All right.
Well, thanks for giving me the courtesy. I wish I could record it.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
And she got up to walk out of the interview room and walked a short distance down the hallway and was met by our arrest team that we had in place. I think that there was the shock that for 26 years that she had gotten away with this, that if I was going to get caught, I was going to get caught early on in the investigation, and it never happened, that this was something that was done, that was never going to come back to haunt her. As we're leaving the building, there were helicopters swarming all over headquarters. The news was already out that we had arrested one of our own for murder, and I remember saying to my partner, my God, what did we just do? Because this was something that's obviously extremely rare. Arresting one of our own members for a murder, I mean, that hadn't happened in decades.
A Los Angeles police detective has pleaded not guilty to the 1986 murder of her ex-boyfriend's wife.
The trial was over 6 weeks in length. Even though you feel that you have phenomenal evidence in a case, you never know how a jury is going to evaluate that evidence. Now, this would be speculation on my part, but I believe, Stephanie went there to try and abduct Sherry, to take her somewhere else, to kill her. And that at the point that Sherry fought back, the plan went awry, and at that point, she had to stage the burglary and then really kind of distance herself from John, because to be close to John after that would have been to greatly increase the likelihood that she would be identified as a suspect.
What we thought was her motive for the murder, she thought that with Sherry out of the way, she could come back into the relationship. But I think she overestimated again how John felt about her. All these things kind of led us to the idea that she had never really gotten over John Rutten as the first love of her life. What I found interesting was when John Rutten got up and made his impact statement.
Your Honor, I'm John Rutten. Sherry Rasmussen had a profound impact on so many people. I was proud that she agreed to be my wife, and the fact that Sherry's death occurred because she met and married me brings me to my knees. I do not know, and fear I will ever know, how to cope with this appalling fact.
Stephanie, during that impact statement, though she didn't look at John Rutten, it seemed like she was paying attention to everything that he was saying, almost as if there was still in her mind a connection between her and John Rutten.
Stephanie had a journal that we found in her home where she had talked about different times that she was upset. There was a very powerful attraction for her to John Rutten, and that she was devastated when he chose to end it and pursue Sherry. And in searching her computers and learning that years after the murder and after she was already married to her husband, that she was still searching for John, trying to see where he lived, for example. She still had not let go of this person from her life or her mind.
We, the jury, in the above-entitled action, find the defendant, Stephanie Eileen Lazarus, guilty of the crime of murder of Sherry Rasmussen.
Stephanie Lazarus got 27 years in prison plus a certain amount of time for the use of a firearm. To me, it doesn't weigh against the amount of time that Sherry never had with the rest of her family. DNA in this particular case gave us the perspective to go back and look at other things, how the apartment looked, how she was treated, and just the idea that it was different from the original theory of the crime. DNA is the linchpin in solving this case. And in this case, it was able to take us all the way through to conviction.
From the 9-1, switch that over, that's the young blonde. I was at the West Coast, now I'm in the East Coast.